Elation and jubilation, gamers from all around the world. I am Lucian and this is the World Gamer Show. And today I want to talk to you about Doom for PS1. The first thing to notice is that Doom's pedigree on consoles wasn't exactly immaculate. However, this version on the first PlayStation is a whole different thing. And not different in the same way that the Super Nintendo was, because of hardware limitations, but different for the sake of it. I don't think that Doom needs a lengthy introduction anyway. Developed by id Software, released in 1993 for MS-DOS, Doom is the father of the first-person shooter genre. It established all the conventions that became standard for every game that came after. Until Halo did it again, years later. But then again, without Doom, there wouldn't have been any Halo to begin with. The games that came out in the following years were so similar to Doom to be dubbed Doom clones. It also helped to legitimize violence in video games, with the help of Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, which led to the creation of the ESRB in America, with the intent to regulate the distribution of violent games. In Doom, the rules are simple. You walk, you see an enemy, you shoot it to death. Rinse and repeat. But there is a reason if such a simple formula worked, and still works wonderfully. Actually, many reasons. From the outstanding level design, through the recognizable enemies, to the sounds that make the weapons and enemies feel as they do, powerful. And of course, the rocking soundtrack, heavily, let's say, inspired by the likes of Slayer, Alice in Chains, and so on. Anyway, the success of this original Doom was so incredible that every video game company and console developer wanted a piece of it. This meant that we had seen Doom in many different incarnations, and they were all attempting at recreating it exactly the way it was in its original form. When the time to port it to the PlayStation finally came, Williams Entertainment, the developers responsible for this version, decided to take a different approach and transform Doom into an atmospheric shooter, almost horror-ish at times, certainly more unsettling than the original. The PlayStation Custom Edition of Doom was a sort of best-of, which included levels from Doom 1 and Doom 2. The levels are still mostly the same with some exceptions. What changed wasn't simply the layout, but the feeling of the levels themselves. This was achieved primarily by altering two very important things: the lighting effects and the sound. The graphics overall are very similar to the original PC version, but the lighting effects gave a much darker feeling to the levels, mostly because, well, they were literally darker. This meant you needed to take it more slowly than before, be much more careful, no more rocking your way through enemies now, again literally, as the rocking tunes gave way to a much darker and more eerie soundtrack. The new ambient soundtrack was composed by Aubrey Hodges, and forgive me if I butchered his name. He opted to go for more of an ambient sound, which perfectly fitted the new visual setting and the slower pace of the action. I actually lied. They also altered a third thing that I believe was for the best. In some levels, the background image is different, and it's Animated! Jeez, this feels totally like hell, like never before. Even more hellish are the sound effects, which all work wonderfully both for the demons and the weapons. The sound effects in the PS1 version go a step further than the music when it comes to the atmosphere, by putting in some spots very eerie and subtle sounds, like the cries of a baby. It's something that was totally absent in the original PC version and made this PS1 release much more uncomfortable to go through in some cases. Try play it at night with your earphones on, and when you start hearing the baby crying, I will be very curious to see your reaction. I can tell you mine. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was wondering if those sounds were actually coming from the game or from somewhere else behind me. Indeed, all of the changes that I mentioned earlier could only work because the basic structure works well. The controls are fast and responsive. The frame rate is solid most of the time, unless of course there are numerous enemies, projectiles or explosions. But to be honest, that wasn't an issue whatsoever during my playthrough. The level design might be a little convoluted sometimes, if not completely labyrinthine, but the useful map is still there. But to be fair, it isn't all sunshine and rainbows, especially not in the Doom world anyway. It lacks a proper split-screen multiplayer, for example. It actually has a multiplayer mode, but it's not that simple. Yes, this is one of those games early in the PlayStation library where your only option to play with a friend was with a link cable to connect two PlayStations. This means that you will also need 2 TVs and 2 copies of the game. Definitely not that handy. And it's a shame because this would have been awesome with the more comfortable multi-tap in 4 players. Alas, it was not meant to be. The controls are mapped a little bit strangely. For example, you fire with the triangle button, but you can completely remap them yourself to suit your playstyle. However, you will need to remap them every time you start the game, and also you will still need to manually scroll through all your weapons to reach the one you want to use, and that's a little bit of a pain in the ass. Also, some could argue that the new lighting effects can sometimes get in the way of fun by not letting you see enough to actually fight enemies back, which in turn can see you very well, even from far distances, and you know, that's not fun. Personally, I'm not among them, and I'm not bothered that much, but I am a horror fanatic. It scares me more what I can't see rather than what I can, but I do see their point. Moreover, some stages have been removed or altered due to hardware limitations. For the same reasons, monsters like the Archvile were omitted, probably due to its habit to constantly revive the nearest monsters, which doesn't really make me miss it anyway. Also, the Spider Mastermind and the Icon of Sin are sadly absent. In some other cases, monsters appear in other locations compared to the original PC version. Aside from just a few more absences anyway, most of the enemy cast is still pretty intact. With actually a new one being added, the Nightmare Spectre, which is basically a darker and much stronger version of the Spectre, which in turn is a half-transparent pinky demon. An interesting fun fact is that this nightmare thing, it's just a flag that is attached to a normal Spectre pinky demon, and technically this could be done with any demons, without impacting the PlayStation's RAM. This means that theoretically, if the developers were assholes, they could even have created a nightmare version of the Cyber Demon. Now, considering how stronger the Nightmare Spectres are compared to the normal ones, I can only imagine how much of a pain in the ass that would have been. Thank you for not doing that. But the important is that my favorite monster is still there, my lovely Revenant. Even better, on the secret level Club Doom, we get to witness a sight to behold, a bunch of sexy Revenant dancing to the disco music.
This is the rhythm of the night. Oh, yeah.
Simply priceless. Anyway, back to the downsides, it's also not compatible with the PlayStation mouse for those who are into this kind of fetish. I know, not that playing an FPS which you could easily play more comfortably on the PC is not a fetish in itself. Another problem is that it's not possible to save during gameplay. Actually, it's not possible to save at all, as this game doesn't support the memory card, and this also goes for the option settings. In the original PC version, you could save anywhere, but here the best you get is a password at the end of each level. This is probably due to, again, hardware limitation, but I find that it actually further contributes to the tension of the game, since now it's required to complete each map in one sitting. Combine it with the eerie soundtrack and the darker visuals, and you get a shooter experience which might appeal also to horror fans. As you probably noticed, this is in no way a definitive version of Doom. However, much like Doom 64 is its own thing, the darker graphics and eerie ambient soundtrack makes it for a unique experience that can also appeal to horror fans and makes this Doom something of a precursor to the tonal shift that we will later see in Doom 3. I feel I can recommend this to open-minded Doom fans who want to play their favorite game but with a twist.